My in-laws made me sleep in the basement. I let them. Then I bought the house. The first night they told me to sleep in the basement is burned into my memory in a way I don't think will ever fade. Not because of the cold concrete or the dim yellow bulb flickering above my head, but because that was the exact moment I understood how completely a man can disappear while still breathing. Because there I was, 52 years old, holding a thin pillow and an old blanket like a kid sent to time out. Standing at the top of the basement stairs while my wife's parents talked over me as if I wasn't even in the room, their voices calm and practical, explaining how it just made sense, how it was only temporary, how everyone needed to make sacrifices, and I remember nodding slowly, forcing a small smile, telling them it was fine, even though inside my chest something felt like it cracked just a little more. Because a husband doesn't get sent to the basement unless he's already been reduced to something less. And as I took that first step down, the sound of laughter drifting from the living room above me, I realized no one was going to stop me. No one was going to say this wasn't right. Not even Linda, my own wife, who stood there quietly avoiding my eyes like if she didn't look at me, she wouldn't have to feel guilty. And that silence from her hurt more than anything her parents had ever said. Because when the person you built your life around stops defending your place in it, you start to wonder when exactly you became optional. And as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air colder, heavier, smelling faintly of dust and old cardboard, I stood there listening to my heartbeat thumping in my ears, loud and lonely, realizing that upstairs life was continuing without me. Dinner plates clinking, a television turning on. Normal sounds of a family that no longer included me in any real way. And that was when the truth hit me hard and clear. I wasn't a husband in that house anymore. I wasn't even a guest. I was a problem they didn't know where to put, so they put me where they didn't have to see me, and I won't lie. A part of me wanted to grab my keys, walk out the door, and never come back, because pride tells you to leave when respect is gone. But exhaustion has a way of quieting pride, especially when you've spent years carrying everyone else's weight. And instead of walking out, I made the choice that probably surprised them even more than it surprised me. I stayed. I laid that pillow down on an old couch that smelled like damp fabric and forgotten summers. I stretched out under low beams that forced me to hunch my shoulders like I was apologizing just by existing. And I stared at the ceiling thinking about how I had ended up here. How a man who once ran his own business, paid mortgages, solved problems, and showed up for everyone had somehow become someone who needed to be tucked away. And as the furnace kicked on with a rattling groan, I realized that this basement wasn't just a place they put me. It was a reflection of how small they thought I was, and that realization hurt in a deep, quiet way. The kind of hurt that doesn't explode right away. The kind that sinks in slowly and settles behind your eyes, making you stare into the dark, replaying moments you ignored. Like the first time my opinion didn't matter at dinner, the first time Linda's father spoke over me about finances, the first time Linda chose peace with her parents over honesty with me, and lying there in that basement, listening to their footsteps above me, I understood something else too, something important. That sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is not shout, not argue, not fight back, but stay quiet while everyone around him assumes he's defeated. Because silence gives you space to think, to watch, to remember. And as the hours passed and sleep refused to come, I started seeing the situation not just as humiliation, but as information. Because when people think you're broken, they stop hiding their true selves. They say things they wouldn't normally say. They make moves they assume you're too weak to notice. And that basement, as cold and lonely as it was, became the first place in a long time where no one was demanding anything from me. No one was judging me out loud, and in that quiet, something shifted inside my chest, not anger exactly, but resolve, because I realized I had spent too long trying to earn respect from people who only valued what I provided, not who I was. And that night, wrapped in an old blanket, staring at the shadows cast by that single bulb, I stopped asking myself why they were doing this to me, and started asking a much more dangerous question. What happens if I stop trying to be accepted and start taking my power back? And that was the night I made a promise to myself, a promise no one upstairs knew about, that I would let them believe whatever they wanted about me, that I was weak, tired, finished, because while they slept comfortably above me thinking they had won, I was already planning something they never saw coming, something that didn't involve shouting or revenge fueled by rage, but patience, timing, and the quiet confidence of a man who finally understood his own worth. And as strange as it sounds, that cold basement floor became the place where I stopped begging for respect and started rebuilding myself, piece by piece in the dark, where no one was watching. I wasn't always the guy standing there confused with a pillow in his hands, because for most of my life I was the man people leaned on without even asking if I could handle more weight. I was the provider, the fixer, the steady one. The guy who woke up before sunrise and went to bed thinking about tomorrow's bills, tomorrow's problems, tomorrow's responsibilities. And I didn't complain because that's how I was raised. You show up, you do the work, and you don't keep score. And for years that mindset worked just fine. I ran a small construction business with my own two hands, built it from scratch, learned every angle of it. Paid my taxes, paid my employees, paid my mortgage, and made sure the lights stayed on no matter what. And when Linda and I married, I promised her stability, not luxury, just a life where she didn't have to worry about the ground disappearing under her feet. And I kept that promise, year after year. Until the day everything shifted in a way I never saw coming. The day she collapsed in the kitchen clutching her chest, fear written all over her face. And in that moment nothing else mattered, not the business, not the money, not the future I had planned. Because when the doctor said the words health scare and long recovery, I didn't hesitate. I told myself work could wait. Contracts could be paused and money could be rebuilt. But Linda needed me now, and that's what a husband does. Or at least that's what I believed. So I sold the business I had poured my life into, told myself it was temporary, just until things stabilized, just until she was strong again. And at first everyone praised me for it, called me devoted, called me a good man. And I wore those words like armor, believing sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. But life doesn't always play fair, because recovery took longer than expected, and then longer than that. And during that time her parents started showing up more often, first to help, then to advise, and finally to supervise. And without realizing it, my house stopped feeling like mine. Conversations started happening without me. Decisions were made while I was in the room but not really included. And slowly, quietly, my role began to change. Not because I failed, but because I was no longer producing in a way they could measure. And in a world obsessed with productivity, a man who pauses becomes suspicious. And I watched as Linda leaned more on her parents emotionally, as they filled the silence I left behind when I stopped being the busy provider and became the available caregiver. And instead of being appreciated for that shift, I felt myself becoming background noise, like a piece of furniture everyone forgets was once brand new. And the worst part is I didn't notice it happening right away. Because when you're raised to believe that real men hold families together no matter what, you don't question why you're the only one still trying. You don't ask why your sacrifices are expected but never acknowledged. You just keep adjusting, keep bending, keep telling yourself this is what love looks like. And by the time I realized my opinions were being brushed aside, my financial decisions questioned, my presence tolerated instead of welcomed, Linda's parents were already deeply rooted in our daily lives, offering suggestions that felt more like instructions, speaking about the house as if it belonged to them emotionally, even if it didn't on paper. And Linda, tired and worn down by her own struggles, started letting them take the lead because it was easier than pushing back. And that's when something dangerous happens in a marriage, when ease replaces partnership. Because once someone else starts making decisions for you, they don't want to give that power back. And I felt myself shrinking without meaning to. Lowering my voice, choosing silence over conflict, convincing myself this was temporary, that once Linda fully recovered things would go back to normal. But normal had quietly packed its bags and left without saying goodbye. And suddenly the man who once paid every bill was being questioned about spending. The man who once decided where we lived was being told how the house should be arranged. And the man who once felt like the foundation of the family was now being treated like an extra beam that could be moved if it got in the way. And it didn't happen all at once. That's the part people don't understand. It happened in small moments. A look exchanged between her parents. A decision announced instead of discussed. A suggestion from me met with polite silence. And before I knew it, my role had shifted from husband to inconvenience, from partner to problem. And the irony is that no one ever said it out loud because they didn't have to. Their actions spoke clearly enough. And looking back now, I can see how dangerous my silence was. How every time I chose peace over honesty, I taught them that my comfort was optional. And by the time I finally understood what was happening, the balance of power had already changed. Linda's parents were calling the shots. Linda was letting them. And I was standing there wondering how a man who gave everything could somehow end up being treated like he was taking too much. And that realization didn't come with anger at first. It came with confusion, then sadness, and finally a deep, quiet awareness that something had gone terribly wrong. Not because I failed as a provider, but because I forgot that providing does not mean disappearing, and that lesson, as painful as it was, would eventually become the first step toward reclaiming the man I used to be. When Linda's father cleared his throat that evening and said, in that careful tone people use when they already know the outcome, that it would probably be more comfortable if I took the basement so her mother could have the guest room, the room went strangely quiet, not because anyone was shocked, but because everyone was waiting for me to do what I had trained them to expect, which was agree without making things awkward. And I remember standing there for a second longer than usual, looking at their faces, noticing how no one actually met my eyes, how Linda stared at the floor, how her mother folded her hands like this was already settled business. And in that moment I realized nobody was asking how I felt. They were just giving me my assignment. And I nodded, because nodding had become easier than speaking. Because years of adjusting had taught me that resistance only made me look difficult. And as I carried my pillow and blanket down the stairs that night, the weight of that decision hit me harder with every step, because that basement wasn't just a physical space, it was a message, a quiet one but clear as day, that my comfort mattered less than everyone else's convenience. And at first I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a room, just a short-term thing. But once I was down there alone, surrounded by dusty boxes filled with old photo albums, broken lamps, and half-forgotten Christmas decorations, it felt like I had been placed among memories instead of people, like I belonged to the past more than the present. And sitting there on that old couch with springs pressing into my back, listening to footsteps above me, laughter drifting down through the floorboards, I felt something inside me finally give way, not in a dramatic explosion, not with yelling or anger, but in a quiet, unsettling calm that scared me more than rage ever could, because that calm was the sound of acceptance ending. The moment where a man stops arguing for his place and starts seeing the truth of his position. And as I lay there staring at the exposed pipes running across the ceiling, I replayed every small moment that led me here, every time I swallowed my pride to keep the peace. Every time I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over. Every time I chose silence over honesty because I thought love meant endurance. And I realized that those choices had slowly trained everyone around me to believe I would always move out of the way, always make room, always take less. And that realization hurt deeply, because it meant this wasn't just something being done to me. It was something I had unknowingly allowed. And that night, lying there with the hum of the furnace filling the silence, something fundamental shifted inside my chest, a kind of emotional circuit breaker flipping off, because I stopped feeling the need to explain myself, stopped feeling the urge to defend my worth, and instead started observing everything with a new clarity, noticing the way Linda's parents spoke about finances like they were already in charge, the way Linda deferred to them without even realizing it, the way my absence from upstairs went completely unnoticed. And in that quiet observation, I began filing things away mentally, not out of bitterness, but out of awareness, because every dismissive comment, every look that passed over me. Every decision made without my input became information, and information is powerful when paired with patience. And as strange as it sounds, that basement became the first place where I truly saw the situation for what it was, stripped of excuses and hope, and I understood that a line had been crossed, not because I was sleeping downstairs, but because no one thought it mattered, and that was the moment something broke inside me for good. The part of me that kept trying to earn my place through sacrifice. Because once a man realizes he is being quietly erased, he has two choices. He can fade completely, or he can stop explaining himself and stop preparing. And as I lay there that night, surrounded by things no one wanted anymore, I chose the second path, not with anger, not with threats, but with a calm resolve that told me this was no longer about comfort or compromise. This was about dignity. And while everyone upstairs slept believing the problem had been neatly placed out of sight, I was awake in the dark, no longer arguing, no longer pleading, but thinking, watching, and slowly understanding that silence, when chosen instead of forced, can become the most powerful move a man ever makes. What my in-laws never understood, and what I never corrected them on, was that before I became the quiet man sleeping in the basement under their feet, I was someone who had spent most of his adult life navigating contracts, negotiations, and pressure without breaking. Because running a construction business isn't just about swinging a hammer or supervising a job site. It's about reading people, understanding motives, knowing when someone is bluffing and when they're serious, and learning how to protect yourself on paper long before emotions ever enter the room. And for decades I did exactly that, quietly, consistently, without fanfare, signing deals, reviewing clauses, spotting risks before they became disasters, and walking away from situations that didn't sit right. But when you step away from visible power, people assume you've lost it altogether, and that's exactly the mistake my in-laws made. Because they looked at me and saw a tired middle-aged man who no longer left the house in work boots every morning, a man who slept in the basement and kept his head down, and they assumed my edge was gone, that whatever strength I once had faded along with my business, and I let them believe that, because correcting them would have required effort I was no longer willing to spend. And while they talked freely around me, discussing finances, ownership, plans for the future as if I were invisible, I was listening with a level of focus that surprised even me, not because I was plotting out of spite, but because I was finally seeing the full picture without the blur of obligation or guilt, and I noticed patterns, like who actually paid the mortgage on time and who only talked about it, who understood the numbers and who just spoke confidently, whose name appeared where and whose name was suspiciously absent, and I began quietly reviewing old paperwork late at night in the basement, pulling out files I had once trusted without rereading, agreements I had signed years ago to help Linda's parents during a tough period, guarantees I had offered, because at the time it felt like family helping family. And as I went through those documents with fresh eyes, I realized something important, something they had completely overlooked, which was that influence does not always sit in the most obvious place. And while they occupied the rooms upstairs and spoke as if the house belonged to them emotionally, the foundation of that house was tied to decisions I had made, risks I had taken, and responsibilities I had carried. And the more I understood that, the calmer I became, because knowledge has a way of steadying you when emotions threaten to take over. And instead of feeling small in that basement, I started feeling patient, because being underestimated buys you something valuable, time. Time to watch how people behave when they think you no longer matter. Time to notice their carelessness, their assumptions, their blind spots. And I saw how freely they spoke, how openly they dismissed me, how confident they were that I would never challenge anything, and that confidence made them sloppy, because people who think they have already won stop protecting themselves. And as the days passed, I began to understand that my silence had changed from weakness into strategy without me even planning it that way. Because every time they talked over me, every time they assumed I didn't understand, they revealed more than they realized, and I absorbed it all quietly, filing it away, not with anger but with clarity, because anger clouds judgment and clarity sharpens it. And in that quiet observation, I rediscovered a part of myself I thought I had lost, the part that knew how to wait, how to read a room, how to move when the timing was right instead of reacting emotionally. And that realization brought a strange sense of peace, because I no longer felt the need to prove who I was to people who had already decided who they wanted me to be. And instead of fighting for a seat at a table that no longer respected me, I started preparing to build leverage of my own, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation, because the truth is, time is dangerous in the hands of someone who's finally done being nice, and while they believed I was slowly fading away in that basement, I was actually becoming more aware, more focused, and more resolved than I had been in years, understanding that power doesn't always shout, sometimes it waits, and that the man they thought they had reduced to nothing still knew exactly how to stand back up when the moment came. By the time weeks quietly turned into months, the basement stopped feeling like a temporary arrangement and started feeling like a sentence no one planned to revisit. And what hurt more than the cold seeping up through the concrete, or the constant low hum of the furnace, was the slow realization that Linda had stopped truly seeing me at all. Because betrayal doesn't always crash into your life with shouting and slammed doors. Sometimes it just drifts in softly and takes a seat, acting like it belongs there. And I noticed it first in the small things. The way she stopped asking how my day was, even though my days had become long stretches of silence. The way she no longer checked if I was eating properly or sleeping well. The way conversations that once included me now happened upstairs without anyone thinking to call my name. And at first I told myself I was imagining it, that she was tired, overwhelmed, still healing. But denial has an expiration date, and mine came one quiet afternoon when I heard voices drifting down through the basement door. Linda and her mother talking freely, unaware that I could hear every word, and I wasn't even trying to listen at first. But then I heard my situation being discussed like a problem that needed managing, not a marriage that needed saving. And when Linda said, in a calm, almost relieved tone, that things would be easier once I adjusted to my new place, something inside my chest tightened, because she didn't say my name. She didn't say my husband. She didn't say Rick. She spoke about me like a piece of furniture that had finally been moved out of the way. And standing there in the shadows near the stairs, my heart pounding, I understood in that instant that love hadn't ended in some dramatic moment. It had simply stepped aside quietly to make room for convenience. And that realization hit harder than any argument ever could, because arguments at least mean someone still cares enough to fight. But this was indifference, and indifference is cold in a way anger never is. And as I leaned against the wall, listening to them discuss plans, finances, future arrangements as if I were already gone, I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. Sadness for the years I thought we were building something together, and clarity because I finally saw where I stood. And what shocked me most wasn't her parents' tone, because I had come to expect that it was Lynn, the woman who once held my hand and promised partnership, now choosing comfort over loyalty without even realizing she was doing it. And that was the quiet betrayal I never saw coming, not because it was hidden, but because I never imagined she would let me fade out of her life while I was still right there under the same roof. And that moment forced me to confront a painful truth, that I had been explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was, defending my worth to people who no longer valued it. And as I stood there alone in the basement, the hum of the furnace suddenly louder than my own thoughts, I made a decision that would change everything, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. I decided I was done trying to be understood by people who were comfortable misunderstanding me, done justifying my presence, done shrinking to fit into a story that no longer included me. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift, a kind of emotional withdrawal, not from life, but from the need for approval. Because when you realize the people closest to you have already rewritten your value in their heads, the only power you have left is choosing how you respond. And standing there in that dim basement, I chose silence, not as surrender, but as distance. Because sometimes the strongest move a man can make is to stop explaining himself and start letting the truth reveal itself in time. I let them think I was weak, not because I had given up, but because I finally understood something I wish I had learned years earlier, that there is a quiet kind of power in being underestimated. And while they assumed I spent my nights in that basement replaying my failures and feeling sorry for myself, I was actually doing the opposite. I was rebuilding myself piece by piece in silence, reconnecting with parts of my life I had set aside when I thought sacrifice alone could hold a marriage together. And I did it slowly, carefully, without announcing anything. Because the moment people believe you are no longer a threat is the moment they stop guarding their words and their mistakes. And every evening after the house went quiet upstairs, I pulled out old folders, yellowed papers, Contracts I had signed years ago without thinking twice because at the time I believed family meant trust without conditions, and as I reread them with a clear head, I began to see the truth about the house they treated like a throne, the house they spoke about as if it were proof of their authority, because what none of them realized, not Linda, not her parents, was that I had helped structure that purchase years ago when they were struggling and pride wouldn't let them admit how close they were to losing everything. And I remembered the late-night phone calls, the tense conversations, the way they asked for help without using the word help, and I stepped in then without hesitation, because that's what family does. And my name wasn't on the front page of the paperwork, not in bold letters where everyone could see it, but it was woven deep into the foundation through loans, guarantees, and agreements they barely understood, because they trusted me to handle the details while they focused on appearances. And now those details mattered more than ever, and as I reviewed everything, I felt something steady return to me. Not anger, not bitterness, but confidence, because facts don't care about emotions, and the facts were on my side. And during the day I stayed quiet, nodded when spoken to, kept my voice calm, let them continue believing their version of the story where I was the tired man who had lost his edge, and I watched as arrogance slowly replaced caution in them. Because people who think they have already won stop being careful, they speak more freely, they make plans without considering consequences, they treat the person they believe is powerless with open dismissal, and every time they did that, they revealed more, and I listened. I observed how they talked about the house, about finances, about the future, assuming I was no longer part of it, and that assumption made them careless, and while they relaxed upstairs, convinced they were in control, I quietly reached out to old contacts from my business days. People who still respected my word, people who knew how I operated, and those conversations reminded me of who I had been before I started shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. And each call, each document, each quiet realization added another brick to something solid inside me, because pretending to be weak gave me time, and time gave me clarity, and clarity gave me leverage, and I didn't rush anything, because I wasn't looking for drama or confrontation, I was looking for certainty. The kind that doesn't shake when voices get loud, and as days turned into weeks, I became more comfortable letting them believe their version of me, because it kept them predictable, and predictability is a gift when you're preparing for change. And there were moments when it was hard, moments when swallowing my pride felt heavy, moments when being talked down to tested my patience, but every time that happened, I reminded myself that this wasn't surrender, it was strategy, because strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly while others expose themselves, and by the time they realized I wasn't as powerless as they thought, it would already be too late to undo the assumptions they had made, and that knowledge brought me a calm I hadn't felt in years, because for the first time since everything started unraveling, I wasn't reacting to their decisions, I was preparing my own, and in that preparation, I found something I had lost along the way, not control over them, but control over myself, which is the only kind of control that truly matters.
The day everything shifted arrived not with a storm or confrontation, but with an almost imperceptible calm that somehow made the weight I had been carrying for months feel both heavier and lighter at the same time, because on that afternoon I found myself sitting across from a lawyer in a small office, whose walls smelled faintly of old leather and the faint tang of ink, and I remember staring at the polished wood table between us, papers spread out in a careful, deliberate arrangement, each one a fragment of a life I had quietly reconstructed in my mind over countless nights in that basement, and as I began explaining every detail, every hidden clause, every agreement, every guarantee that I had once signed to protect the family or to smooth over moments of tension, I could feel my own pulse slowing, not out of fear but out of focus, because finally I was speaking from knowledge, from preparation, from strategy instead of emotion. And the lawyer listened intently, asking questions at just the right moments, pointing out the opportunities embedded in the documents, the leverage I had unknowingly accumulated over the years, and when he finally looked up with a calm but unmistakable tone and said that I had more control than I realized, I felt a relief so profound that it almost made my chest ache, because for years I had been underestimated, dismissed, and relegated to the basement as if I were invisible, and now, in one quiet room with one patient listener, I realized that the very structures they thought were theirs were built on my foresight they had ignored, and I understood then that power does not need to announce itself with shouting, that patience and knowledge could move mountains without raising a voice. And I remember walking back to the house later that afternoon carrying the weight of both history and future in my hands, knowing that as I descended the basement stairs, The same steps that had felt like a slow march into invisibility just months before. I was now walking into a home that was technically slipping from the control of those who had thought themselves untouchable, and the irony of it was intoxicating because they had assumed I was broken, beaten, finished, when in reality I had been quietly gathering all the pieces necessary to reclaim not just my dignity but also tangible authority. And that night, as I settled into the cold, familiar basement, the hum of the furnace and the chill of the concrete floor felt entirely different. No longer oppressive but oddly comforting, because I knew that every creak above me, every laugh, every casual conversation that I could hear through the floorboards carried the weight of ignorance. Ignorance that I had turned into leverage, and for the first time in what felt like years, the cold did not bother me, the solitude did not bother me, and even the isolation felt purposeful, because I had transformed what they considered a punishment into a vantage point, a place from which I could watch, calculate, and eventually act. And as I stared at the scattered papers and old boxes around me, I felt an unusual sense of clarity, a merging of past preparation and present opportunity, because the days of being reactive were over, the endless compromise and silence had served their purpose, and now action could be taken quietly, deliberately, without noise. And that realization, that almost sacred understanding of control without confrontation, brought a calm I had not felt since before all of this had begun, and in that calm I began to envision the steps that would follow, not fueled by anger, but by precision, because when people assume weakness in you, their arrogance creates openings, and I intended to use every one of them, to reclaim not only my place in the house but also the respect that had been quietly stripped from me over the years. And the beauty of it was that I did not need to fight in the way they would have expected, did not need to raise my voice or make a scene, because the legal and financial truths I had meticulously gathered would speak louder than any argument or shouting match ever could. And as the hours passed that night, I went through the motions of my usual basement routine, arranging blankets, checking the furnace, making sure the small lamp gave enough light to work by. Yet each movement was layered with the knowledge of what was about to unfold, and I realized I had spent so long internalizing humiliation that I had forgotten the thrill of quiet, deliberate preparation, the satisfaction of turning perceived weakness into calculated strength. And as sleep finally claimed me, I understood something profoundly liberating. I was no longer just a man forced to endure. I was a man who had regained agency, who had turned the basement into both a shield and a command center. And in that stillness, I felt the first taste of true empowerment in years, the exhilarating recognition that the people above me, who believed they had won, were already playing into my hands, completely unaware that the game had changed without them even noticing. And it was in that silence, in that deliberate, measured quiet, that I realized control was not about volume. It was about understanding, strategy, and timing. And for the first time in my life, I felt the power of all three resting fully in my hands, as real, as tangible, and as deeply satisfying as any confrontation could ever be.
I will never forget the look on my father-in-law's face the day the letter arrived, because it was the exact moment confidence drained out of him like air from a tire, slow at first and then all at once. And I was sitting quietly at the small table in the basement pretending to sort through old paperwork when I heard his voice upstairs change. Not loud, not angry, just thinner somehow, like a man trying to keep control of a situation that was already slipping through his fingers. And within minutes, the entire mood of the house shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Conversations that were usually casual suddenly dropped into whispers, footsteps paced back and forth instead of moving with purpose, doors opened and closed more carefully, and for the first time since I had been sent downstairs, there was hesitation in the air, because reality has a way of showing up uninvited and making people uncomfortable. And that letter did exactly that. It didn't accuse. It didn't threaten. It simply stated facts they had ignored for too long, facts wrapped in legal language they barely understood. And as the minutes passed, I heard Linda's mother asking questions that didn't have easy answers. I heard my father-in-law repeating the same sentence in different ways, as if saying it again might change its meaning. And what struck me most in that moment was how quickly authority can vanish when it's built on assumptions instead of truth. Because for months they had spoken about the house as if it were unquestionably theirs, as if ownership was something you declared instead of something you proved. And now that illusion was cracking. And slowly, carefully, I walked up the stairs, Not to announce anything, not to explain, just to exist in the same space. And the way they looked at me then was completely different from how they had looked at me before, because suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. Suddenly I wasn't the quiet man in the basement who could be dismissed. I was a variable they hadn't accounted for. And there is something deeply unsettling to people when someone they underestimated becomes important again, not because of respect, but because of necessity. And that's when I understood a strange kind of justice, the kind that doesn't come with yelling or satisfaction, but with clarity. Because watching people who ignored you scramble when they realize the ground beneath them is no longer solid is both sobering and revealing. And I didn't say much, I didn't need to, because the silence carried more weight than any argument I could have made. And every time they glanced at me, it was clear they were seeing me differently, not as family, not even as an equal, but as someone who now held answers they desperately wanted. And that shift was unmistakable. And later that evening, Belinda finally came down to the basement, a step slower than usual, her voice careful when she asked if we could talk. I knew the story had crossed a line it could never go back from, because she wasn't coming down to check on me, she wasn't coming down to apologize, she was coming down because the balance had changed. And standing there in that same basement where I had once felt erased, I saw hesitation in her eyes, uncertainty mixed with something that looked a lot like regret. And I realized that silence had done its job, because silence had forced the truth to surface on its own, without me pushing it, without me begging to be heard. And as she spoke, trying to explain, trying to soften the moment, I listened without interrupting, because I understood now that timing mattered more than words. And the timing belonged to me, and that moment, quiet and tense and heavy with unspoken understanding, was when they all realized something they never expected. That the house they treated like a throne was no longer theirs in the way they believed. That control doesn't come from occupying space, it comes from understanding it. And as I stood there in that basement, no longer cold, no longer small, I felt a calm certainty settle in, because the power dynamic had shifted without a single raised voice. And sometimes, the most profound victories arrive not with celebration, but with the quiet realization that everything has changed, and there is nothing anyone can do to put it back the way it was. When the deal finally closed, and the keys were officially in my hands, the feeling that washed over me was not the kind of triumph movies like to show, not a fist-pumping, chest-thumping victory, but a quiet, almost startling clarity, because buying that house wasn't about revenge or punishing anyone, it was about reclaiming a part of myself I had long let slip away while I tried to keep the peace, while I bent, bowed, and quietly endured so everyone else could feel comfortable and in control. And as I walked through the familiar hallways, the same hallways where I had been treated like an inconvenience, where my presence upstairs had been tolerated at best, and my very existence dismissed at worst, I felt the weight of those months of invisibility lift off my shoulders, and it hit me just how much of my life I had spent shrinking myself, muting my voice, and pretending to be small so others could feel large, because it had never been just about a basement or a room or a place to sleep. It had been about the constant erosion of respect, the way people can slowly rewrite your worth without ever saying it out loud. And now, standing in the very living room where my opinions had been ignored, where decisions were made over my head and around me, papers in hand confirming every clause, every guarantee, every legal detail that proved my claim, I felt something return that had been missing for years, a calm, undeniable dignity, the kind that cannot be argued with, cannot be shouted down, and cannot be taken from you once it has been reclaimed. And when I finally told Linda's parents that they would need to find another place to live because I now own what I had built into, what I had quietly protected, and what they had assumed was theirs to control, I did it without yelling, without making a scene, my voice steady and calm, because I knew by now that dignity does not need volume, it needs conviction. And as I spoke, I could see the shock in their eyes. Mixture of disbelief, embarrassment, and perhaps even grudging respect, because nothing undermines arrogance faster than a quiet truth delivered without malice, and the silence that followed was thick and heavy, heavier than any insult they had ever thrown my way, heavier than the nights I had spent alone in the basement imagining arguments and explanations that would never have mattered, because there, in that moment, silence became a statement, and I realized that all those years of compromise and sacrifice, of swallowing pride and standing still, had led to this one moment where the world could no longer dictate my worth, could no longer assume what I would accept, and I looked around the rooms that had once been filled with conversations that excluded me, decisions that ignored me, and furniture that made me feel like an outsider. And now, each corner, each wall, each piece of space belonged to me in the most concrete, undeniable sense, not just legally, but emotionally, spiritually. Because ownership here was about more than paper, it was about reclaiming a life, a narrative, and a presence that had been dismissed for far too long. And as I walked slowly from room to room, touching surfaces I had once avoided, remembering the nights I spent thinking I had lost everything, I understood something profoundly important. That true dignity is not given. It is quietly, relentlessly reclaimed piece by piece, without shouting, without rage, without spectacle, but with patience, foresight, and an unshakable sense of self. And in that quiet reclamation, I felt a freedom unlike anything I had imagined, a calm satisfaction that comes not from breaking others, but from finally being whole in your own right. And as Linda's parents slowly gathered their belongings, moving quietly through the house that had been a battlefield of emotions and unspoken tensions, I watched without resentment, because the point was never to crush them. It was to stand, unshaken in the place I had earned, to show that even when people try to diminish you, even when those closest to you turn a blind eye, you still have the power to rise, to reclaim, and to assert your worth simply by existing with conviction. And in that living room, once a symbol of my invisibility, now a testament to my resolve, I finally understood that the weight of pride, the burden of being underestimated, and the nights spent alone in cold shadows had all been necessary not to break me, but to prepare me for a moment when I could finally step forward with calm authority. And as the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the rooms I had fought to reclaim, I felt a deep, quiet joy that had nothing to do with anyone else's acknowledgement, and everything to do with finally taking back not just a house, but my life, my voice, and my dignity in a way that no one could ever diminish again. I don't tell this story to boast about how it ended, because pride was never the lesson, and victory was never about humiliation or making someone else feel small. I tell it because the lessons I learned during those long, quiet months in the basement are the ones every man should carry before it's too late. Lessons about respect, dignity, patience, and the quiet strength that grows when you are forced to confront your own invisibility. Because respect is not something you beg for or plead to receive. It is something you hold on to, protect fiercely, and never allow to be stripped away by those who mistake their loud voices for authority. And love that only survives when you shrink yourself, when you stop speaking up, when you disappear from the spaces that once mattered is not love at all. It is convenience masquerading as affection, and understanding that truth changed everything for me. Because for years I had measured my worth by sacrifice alone, by the weight I carried, by the bills I paid, by the people I shielded from the consequences of their own arrogance, and I had convinced myself that that was enough, that showing up silently, agreeing quietly, adjusting endlessly, was the proof of a life well lived and a marriage worth protecting. But the basement taught me a different kind of lesson. It taught me that true strength isn't about endurance or patience in the abstract. It is about knowing when to bend and when to rise, when to observe and when to act, and most importantly, it is about reclaiming yourself on your own terms, not at someone else's convenience, and walking out of that house for the last time not as a guest, not as a tolerated burden, but as the rightful owner of every wall, every room, every decision that had been quietly ignored or manipulated. I felt a lightness I hadn't known in decades, a freedom born not from taking from others, but from finally standing fully, unapologetically, in my own power. And the basement, which had once been the cold, lonely space where I had questioned my value, where the darkness seemed to swallow every ounce of confidence I thought I had, became in retrospect the place where I rebuilt my backbone, piece by piece, day by day, document by document, observation by observation, because sometimes life pushes you underground not to bury you, but to give you the solitude and clarity to develop roots that are strong enough to hold you through storms that you never imagined you would face. And in that quiet darkness, I learned the importance of strategy over impulse, patience over confrontation, and observation over reaction. And I realized that while anger and loud retaliation may feel satisfying in a moment, they rarely leave you stronger. whereas calm, deliberate preparation leaves you unshakable. And when I finally emerged, walking through the front door, the sun hitting my face in a way that reminded me life was still vibrant, still moving. I stepped into a world where my voice mattered again, where my presence was no longer negotiable, where my decisions were respected not because I demanded respect, but because I had shown what it meant to protect it. And every step I took across the yard, every glance back at the house that had once been a stage for my invisibility, reminded me of the patience, foresight, and resilience that had carried me here. And I understood that the basement, with its cold floors, its hum of the furnace, and its solitude, had been both punishment and training ground. A place where the man I thought I had lost was quietly being reborn. And as I walked away, keys in hand, no malice in my heart, I realized that life does not always give second chances, but it does give opportunities to reclaim your story if you are willing to wait, watch, and prepare. And that lesson, more than any courtroom victory or financial leverage, was the one I would carry forever. Because when you finally rise, you do it on your own terms, fully aware of your own worth. And in that rise lies a peace and strength that no one, not even those who tried to diminish you, can ever take away.